She didn't fall in love with him all at once. It happened slowly, in the late-night conversations, in the gentle promises, in the way he spoke about the future, as if she belonged inside it. He wasn't perfect. She knew that. But he knew how to say things that made her believe he could be everything she hoped for. And sometimes, hope is louder than truth. She didn't love who he really was. Not at first. She loved the possibility, the potential, the version of him she imagined when he showed her just enough softness to keep her heart invested. He talked about change. He talked about growth. He talked about wanting to be better. And she believed him. Not because he proved it, but because she needed to believe that love could grow where it was planted. She wasn't naive. She was hopeful. And there is a difference. But sometimes, hope can blind us more than lies ever could. The early gestures felt like promises, the long texts, the attention, the eye contact that made her feel chosen. He told her things she had waited years to hear, things that made her think, maybe he's the one I prayed for. And she held on to those moments, even when everything else began to fade. He didn't call as often. He didn't ask how she was doing. He didn't show up the way he used to. His presence became inconsistent, his affection unpredictable, his interest unreliable. But whenever she thought about walking away, he gave her crumbs of sweetness again, a soft message, a memory shared, a glimpse of the man she thought he could become. And that was enough to keep her hoping. She convinced herself that he was just overwhelmed, just distracted, just going through a phase, just misunderstood, just not ready yet. She filled in his silence with explanations. She justified the distance. She excused the emotional coldness. She rewrote the story in ways that protected her heart from shattering. She wasn't blind. She was loyal to the version of him she wished was real. But deep down, in the place she didn't let herself touch, she knew. She knew the truth she didn't want to see. He loved being admired. He loved being desired. He loved being forgiven. He loved being chosen. He loved being comforted when life was too heavy for him. But loving her, truly loving her, that was different. That required honesty. That required effort. That required consistency. That required him to choose her even when convenience faded. And he never did. She mistook his promises for proof. She mistook his potential for presence. She mistook his words for commitment. She mistook his future talk for actual love. But he loved the feeling she gave him, not the responsibility of loving her in return. She built a whole heart around potential, and potential never became reality. Still, she held on. Because letting go meant admitting she had poured love into someone who would never become the man she imagined. She wasn't afraid of losing him. She was afraid of losing the dream she had woven around him. And that's what kept her there. Not him, not his actions, not his love, but a truth she buried too deeply to face. She loved the future she thought he represented, not the man standing in front of her. And the day she finally saw that would be the day everything changed. She didn't stay because the relationship was good. She stayed because the promises were beautiful. He had a way of speaking about the future that made her heart soften in ways she couldn't control. He talked about someday, about when things get better, about after this season is over, as if he were building a life where she belonged. It wasn't what he did that kept her there. It was what he said. Words became the rope she held onto when reality felt too heavy. And he knew how to tie that rope just tight enough to keep her from letting go. He promised he would try harder. He promised he would be more present. He promised he would open up. He promised he would stop pulling away. He promised he would become someone she wouldn't have to doubt. And she believed him. Not because the evidence was there, but because the ache inside her needed something to believe in. Every woman who has loved deeply knows this kind of hope. The hope that whispers, maybe this time he means it. And every time he disappointed her, He offered just enough softness to make her think he wasn't finished yet. One heartfelt message. One emotional confession. One night where he held her as if she mattered. One rare moment where his eyes softened and made her think she had misjudged him. And those moments, those tiny windows into a version of him that never stayed, they were powerful. Powerful enough to drown out doubt. Powerful enough to silence her intuition. Powerful enough to convince her that the man she imagined was hiding underneath the man he was. Hope can be intoxicating that way. He didn't have to show consistency. He didn't have to show sacrifice. He didn't have to show love. He only had to keep promising that he would, eventually. And she wasn't holding on to him. She was holding on to, eventually. Eventually he would call more. Eventually he would show up. Eventually he would choose her. Eventually he would commit. Eventually he would see her worth. Eventually he would stop leaving her emotionally starving. But eventually never came. It just lived in his mouth like a gentle distraction, a warm illusion that kept her hoping instead of healing. And the worst part? She knew. Deep down, she knew. There was always a quiet ache beneath the surface, a truth she pushed aside because looking at it meant letting go of the version of him she had built her heart around. So she stayed. Not because he proved himself, but because he painted a future beautiful enough to make her forget the pain of the present. She didn't want to admit that his promises were just stories. Stories he never intended to live. Stories she held like lifelines because they made letting go feel impossible. But there are promises that keep us alive, and promises that keep us stuck. And the promises he gave her were never meant to carry her forward. They were meant to keep her in place. There were signs, small ones at first, quiet shifts in the way he showed up, subtle changes in his tone, moments when his presence felt more like absence held together by routine. But she ignored them, not because she didn't notice, but because noticing meant confronting a truth she wasn't ready to hold. She overlooked the way he took hours to respond, even on days when she knew he wasn't busy. She told herself, he's tired, he's stressed, he needs space. And she meant it. She always gave grace even when grace wasn't returned. She rationalized his inconsistency, explained away his indifference, softened her expectations to match the bare minimum he was willing to give. Because if she let herself admit that he wasn't showing up, then she also had to admit that he never truly intended to. There were weekends he disappeared, reappearing with shallow excuses. There were promises that dissolved the second they became inconvenient. There were conversations where she poured her heart out and he responded with silence. Silence that felt like a wall she kept trying to climb because the view at the top, the dream of who he could be, was too beautiful to abandon. Every time she felt something was wrong, she blamed herself. Maybe she was asking too much. Maybe she was being demanding. Maybe she needed to be more patient, more understanding, more forgiving. He didn't even have to defend himself. She defended him for him. She protected his absence. She justified his distance. She softened every harsh truth until it no longer looked like truth at all. She didn't want to see that he only gave effort when he felt her slipping away. She didn't want to see that affection came only in waves, beautiful, intense, short-lived waves that left her starving when they receded. She didn't want to see that she was always the one reaching out, always the one trying, always the one holding the connection together with trembling hands. Because acknowledging those signs meant acknowledging something even harder. She wasn't losing him. She had never truly had him, and that truth was too painful for her to face. So she closed her eyes to the inconsistencies. She silenced her intuition. She swallowed her questions. She dimmed her needs. She pretended the scraps of affection were signs of love, instead of reminders that he was never fully there. It wasn't blindness. It was self-preservation. Because the truth she didn't want to see was simple and cruel. He wasn't confused. He wasn't unsure. He wasn't struggling. He just wasn't choosing her. And once that realization finally reached her heart, it wouldn't just hurt. It would unravel everything she believed about love, about hope, about the man she thought he could become. Every illusion has a breaking point. Not always loud, not always dramatic. Sometimes the truth arrives quietly, like a single moment that finally weighs more than all the hopes she used to hold. For her, it wasn't a big fight. It wasn't a final betrayal. It wasn't even something he said. It was something he didn't say. One evening, she sent a message. Simple, honest, vulnerable. The kind of message that says, "I need you right now." She waited, and waited. And the hours that followed stretched painfully across her chest, like a truth she no longer had the strength to outrun. He was online. He posted. He laughed in comments. He was active everywhere except in the one conversation where she had finally opened her heart. And that was when the illusion cracked, not all at once, but with a quiet, devastating clarity. He just didn't care the way she did. The realization hit her not like a wound, but like something she'd known all along yet fought to avoid. She remembered the early days, when he would reply instantly, when he seemed invested, when he spoke about a future, as if he actually meant to build one with her. But that night, as she watched him be fully present for everything except her, something inside her clicked. The man she fell for existed only in her imagination. The man she hoped for existed only in her patience. The man she believed in existed only in her willingness to rewrite reality so it wouldn't hurt. He wasn't the man of his promises. He wasn't the man of his gentle words. He wasn't the man of his emotional confessions. He wasn't the man of the one day she built her heart around. He was simply himself, inconsistent, unavailable, emotionally distant, kind when convenient, cold when confronted with responsibility. And she realized, painfully, that she had been in love with who he could have been, not who he was. Her heart didn't shatter because of him. It shattered because she finally accepted what she had spent months avoiding. She wasn't losing a soulmate. She was losing a story she wrote alone. She wasn't grieving a partnership. She was grieving a fantasy stitched together from his best moments and her deepest desires. She wasn't mourning the end of love. She was mourning the end of the illusion that kept her hoping. And in that moment, that quiet, gut-wrenching moment, she felt a strange mix of pain and clarity. Pain for the girl who stayed. Clarity for the woman who finally woke up. Because once the illusion crumbles, you can't rebuild it. You can't unsee the truth. You can't pretend potential is enough. You can't keep loving the version of someone that never actually existed. And for the first time, she saw him without the filter of hope. And that vision wasn't heartbreaking because it was cruel. It was heartbreaking because it was real. The truth didn't arrive like lightning. It didn't roar. It didn't explode. It settled, softly, heavily, quietly, like something that had been waiting inside her for far too long. It came in a moment when she finally let herself stop fighting for a version of him that only existed in her hopes. A moment where she wasn't tired of him. She was tired of hurting. The truth was simple, but its simplicity was what cut the deepest. He was never going to love her the way she loved him. Not because she wasn't worthy. Not because she wasn't enough. But because he didn't have the depth, the courage, the emotional honesty to love anyone fully, including himself. She had spent months trying to interpret his mixed signals, trying to understand the distance, trying to earn the attention that used to come so easily in the beginning. But the truth she can't avoid anymore is that the beginning wasn't love. It was intensity, and intensity fades when someone was never invested to begin with. She realized that she was always the one giving, her time, her forgiveness, her softness, her patience, her hope. And he was always the one taking, Her emotional clarity, her stability, her sense of worth, her ability to trust herself. She didn't want to see it before, because seeing it meant admitting that she had loved alone. She didn't want to confront it, because confronting it meant acknowledging that her heart had built a home in a place where he only came to visit. She didn't want to feel it, because feeling it meant grieving not a relationship, but the future she imagined in her quietest moments. The moments where she thought that if she loved gently enough, he would eventually meet her there. But the truth she couldn't avoid anymore was sitting right in front of her. He didn't show up because he didn't want to. He didn't try because he didn't feel he needed to. He didn't fight for her because losing her didn't scare him. He didn't change because he never intended to. And with that, truth came a kind of heartbreak that wasn't loud, but final. She finally saw that she had spent all her energy loving a man who only invested in her when it benefited his loneliness. She wasn't his choice. She was his comfort. She wasn't his partner. She was his convenience. She wasn't his future. She was his for now. And that truth, as painful as it was, set something free inside her. Because once she stopped waiting for him to love her deeply, she finally had space to start loving herself again. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She wasn't bitter. She was awakened. And that awakening was the beginning of her letting go. Not of him, but of the dream she didn't need to dream anymore. In the end, letting go wasn't a dramatic act. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a final conversation where she demanded answers he was never willing to give. Letting go happened the moment she stopped negotiating with the truth. A truth she had run from, softened, reshaped, and edited because she didn't want it to hurt as deeply as she knew it would. But the truth doesn't disappear just because we don't want to face it. It waits, patiently, quietly, until we're finally strong enough to open the door. And she opened it on a day she least expected. A day when something inside her, something silent, something tired, something wiser, whispered, "You deserve more than potential." It wasn't that she stopped caring about him. It was that she finally cared about herself, more than she cared about the version of him she had created to survive the disappointment. She realized the truth with a calmness that surprised her. She wasn't walking away from love. She was walking away from almost love. And almost love is the slowest way a heart can die. She wasn't losing someone who cherished her. She was losing someone who cherished being adored. She wasn't giving up on a future. She was giving up on a fantasy that had cost her too many nights of doubt and too many mornings of silence. She wasn't abandoning hope. She was finally choosing hope for herself. For the first time, she no longer needed him to be who she imagined. She no longer needed the promises that always fell short. She no longer needed the intensity that never turned into devotion. She no longer needed the someday that never became today. She finally stood in the present, not in the potential. And standing there, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not loud, triumphant peace. Quiet peace. The kind that feels like breathing after holding your breath for far too long. She didn't hate him. She didn't resent him. She didn't wish him pain. She simply released the weight of carrying a connection that only survived because she watered it alone. She stopped waiting for him to choose her. She stopped waiting for him to grow. She stopped waiting for his potential to catch up to her love. And in doing so, she chose something better. Something truer. Something that had been calling her long before she had the courage to answer. She chose herself. Not the version of herself that begged for crumbs. Not the version that doubted her worth. Not the version that loved through fear. But the version that finally understood that love isn't meant to be earned or forced or imagined. Love is meant to be lived. And she was ready, finally, beautifully ready, to live again.